40, 50 in prize money to the best teams in the incubator so that they could actually do something. So, funding or financing has always been a part of what we're doing, and we thought that's sort of also the core. And that's also what how we sort of ended up in a lift program, I suppose. But we had never really thought about blended finance before or had heard the term at all. It was sort of all came together at the lift challenge, and then after the competition, maybe to go fast forward, we were sort of at a point where we were all done with university and had full-time roles. So what we did is that we the programs that we were running, we kept them inside the university and thought that it's a great learning experience for other students to keep on running them. So the incubation programs that we've been doing for those social entrepreneurs, they're still up and running. So now we have a program in Rwanda, a program in Kenya, and a program in Bangladesh, and quite established after a couple of years, but intentionally sort of a student project so that we have this learning experience for the students as well. And we then thought, okay, we'd love to take this outside and then also raise a dedicated fund for that, which we've been trying to do for the last year. I've spent a lot of time in Africa myself, but it's sort of a bit of on ice at the moment because it's probably the worst possible time ever to raise a fund. Since I work for another fund, I know that, so we're sort of waiting things out a little bit until macroeconomic environment gets a little bit easier. But in my day-to-day job, basically, I'm a climate tech investor for another venture capital fund. Been with this company now for a bit over 2 years. And what I've noticed over the last couple of months, that blended finance also plays a super important role in what we're doing, and maybe sort of answering the question that you asked, Jeff, on interesting topics. Because there's lots of climate technologies that we need to get out of the lab and sort of deploy at very large scale if we want to reach our climate targets. Think about sort of carbon capture technology, so more efficient energy generation, energy storage technologies. Those are usually like super early and need a lot of R&D to get to market, and are at the same time very, very capex intensive because it's like large infrastructure asset type projects. And we're actually now within my company working on some blended finance initiatives because we realized that this is not something that venture capital funds alone can fund, and you need sort of different capital stacks and project financiers, banks, but also the public sector sort of stepping in. So that's definitely in my current day-to-day work a super important thing that hasn't been figured out because there's a huge funding gap. And yeah, maybe I'll leave it here when it comes to the background. And quickly on our lift experience. Yeah, for us it was fantastic. I mean, we'd never heard about blended finance before, so it really helped us sort of shaping our strategy and our model. And we ended up raising, I think, 150K or so with the model then for the next year's progress. So it really sort of led to tangible results, and we've gotten so many great inputs and feedbacks from all the mentors and everyone throughout the program that really helped us refine our programs and in the way we support entrepreneurs a lot. So it's been a super enriching experience. And the point I also made last year, I think the main reason why it's been such an enriching experience is that because we didn't see it as a competition, we had like a real project and we wanted this to become better, right? So it was not about winning the competition, but we actually had something in real life that we were working towards. And I felt like that was the main reason why we really took so much out of the mentoring sessions and all the connections that we made, because it was not just about winning the competition, which was nice, of course, but it was really more about improving our project rather than anything else. Maybe I'll leave it with that for now, and happy to talk about anything that might be of interest to you guys, or chat about any ideas that you have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that intro, Florian. That was fantastic. Yeah, so to all the students here, we'd love for you to drive this session. Since it's a coaching session, what are the questions you have for Florian? Are there, whether it's topic-based or experience-based with the competition? Let's start the conversation. Anybody? Oh, okay, there's it in the chat. Okay, so the question is, did you have to rethink your strategy at all in the beginning? So Florian, why don't you, building off of that question, talk about maybe take them through the process your team went through from the moment of registering through and knowing that coaching sessions were different then because you were matched with a coach, right? And we found out that that wasn't always the best way to do it because you're only getting one perspective sometimes. I don't remember who your coach was, but that's what some of the team's feedback was. But kind of from the beginning side to how you maybe molded and formed and changed your strategy from kind of the beginning of the process all the way through to submission of your project, and then after your feedback from the submission round to the live pitches. How's that sound?
Yeah, it's a super good question. I mean, our strategy completely changed, I think. That's maybe the very quick answer. But when we entered the project, I think we had the slight advantage that we knew what we wanted to work on because we sort of had the project, and what we wanted to do is try and find a way in which we can bring this project that we had, which was basically just normal sort of incubation programs for entrepreneurs that you probably have almost in any city, and there's probably thousands of organizations doing them. But how can we take that and sort of bring it into a blended finance structure? That was sort of the challenge that we started out with. And when we started reading into blended finance, it sounded like super complex because I don't have a finance background. I mean, I studied computer science, and then I did a business master's, which helped a little bit, but definitely not an expert in finance, and sort of all the concepts and everything that that came up were quite new. So I think initially it was sort of a bit overwhelming, I suppose, but then really talking things through with the mentors helped a lot to sort of clarify the things. And then I think initially, yeah, we threw around some ideas, but we sort of quickly landed on the fact that what we were doing before was super simple, right? We had some donors, some big corporates, which gave us money and as a grant, and then we gave that out as a grant to companies. So relatively simple. And then we sort of started refining that model by saying, hey, actually, those companies that we're giving money, right? Of course, we want to do something impactful, and they should do something which improves the healthcare system or etc., saves lives. So there's a strong impact narrative, but we also believe that to really have long-term impact, those companies need to be financially sustainable, right? So there's also a financial argument in saying, hey, you can make returns by investing in those companies. And then we sort of, from that, tried to drill it a little bit deeper and understand why there's such a big funding gap for these type of companies in emerging markets. And then, you come to the point where you realize that it's just way too risky. Like no one would put their money into like I don't know. We had a founder in the very first program, for instance, that built a digital health solution in Bangladesh, because if you live in a very rural and remote part of Bangladesh, then you will not have access to healthcare services, but you will likely have a mobile phone, so you can access healthcare services through that. So it's a great business, but it's super risky because Bangladesh is sort of an emerging economy. There's a lot of volatility. There might be currency risk. There might be political risk. And then you anyways can't sort of judge whether their solution makes sense in the local context. So the risk is way too high for equity investors. But at the same time, just giving them grants also was not the purpose, because they are entrepreneurs, right? And they want investments and don't want to hop from grant to grant. And yeah, then we just started iterating really, and then arriving at sort of the final structure of how we had then we had come up with to combine those different flows of capital, so grants and equity investments. That was a super iterative process. And I remember, I don't know if the format is still the same, but we had like the semifinals and the finals and like different pitches in front of different jury members. I think after every pitch, we really redid our our model, because we got like a lot of input, a lot of feedback. So even within sort of the finals, we completely adjusted our presentation to the feedback that we had gotten. Not sure if it was always like that necessary to that extent. Sometimes we could have sticked a little bit more to our original ideas, but definitely constantly iterated with all the inputs that we got. And I think there was also something that the jury definitely appreciated, that we took their feedback on, and we took it seriously, and then we adjusted it, rather than ignoring what inputs they were giving us. Yeah, so that was a bit of a chaotic process, but that's why I think it was a great learning for us. We were just constantly iterating.
Thank you so much, Florian. Next question.
Follow up on that question. Yeah, so you talk on destructured funds, especially when you're talking about venture capital or incubators, and you talk about like ensuring that is financially sustainable. So do you actually like list out the names of the funds, like okay, I'm gonna get this fund from like United Nations development programs, or do you just have an idea of like which portion of the fund will be allocated from like government finance, and which other fund will be allocated from like private equity?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we had funding before. I think before we entered Lyft, we had already raised, I mean, definitely more than $100,000. I don't know. So, but that was only from donors and corporates. And what we had done for the model, because and when we presented it in the Lyft challenge, that was different from what we had done before. So we kind of tried to outline who could be potential donors for the different buckets. And just putting in the high level sort of categories and maybe a few logos of like who could be relevant. So that definitely helps to make it a little bit more concrete, especially for people who might not be super familiar with blended finance. As even within the jury, everyone has a sort of different level of expertise in different fields, and you might not know much about government bonds when you work in venture capital, for instance, etc. So making it more concrete, I think, helps. But then when I then look, I mean, I don't have the slides in mind, but I think the pools of capital that we got afterwards were obviously very different ones than the ones that we had sort of put on a presentation. But I think that doesn't really matter. It's just like showing that you have thought through things and know where you can potentially access those pools of money versus what's actually going to happen afterwards.
Thank you.
And use it as a way to build your pipeline, right? I mean, if you guys enter the competition with the idea of actually doing something with that, then definitely don't see it as like an exercise you do for the sake of it, but use it to do something which is anyways useful for your project.
Great points. Yeah, I'll just add on to that, just to not add on to it, but emphasize what Florian was saying too, is that it doesn't mean, the judges will be looking at, is what you are proposing, is it feasible? Is it something that makes sense, that could actually happen, not something that you have to actually already have had the conversations and agreements in place, because that would take a lot longer than the time in a competition, right? Just to make sure that you're using real organizations, and the way that you're structuring is something that actually is something they would consider being a part of, right? Yeah.
Sort of sense checking. I mean, like to give you an example, so we had in the student NGO that we now have that runs the program. So the last year was a bit rough because we've had like some internal problems, and then so we completely got a new leadership on board. And I was having a call with them last week, and then one of the new girls that is in there, she was saying, "Oh, we're gonna raise money from venture capital funds, right?" To which I'm like, no single venture capital fund is going to give you money for that, right? So because it's not what they would do. So like, and that's the sort of, I guess, high level sense checking that you should probably be doing. Like, does this make sense, or do you just put it there without thinking about it?
Great points. Thanks for the example too.
Yeah, thank you. I do have another follow-up question on that. So obviously when you look at the projects, you have like certain I would say like criteria to look at the like you say about feasibility, and also a lot of projects touch upon like the scalability aspect of the project. So what are the like major components that we should have in mind when we're devising these projects? And another point on like feasibility, how do you have follow any structures to measure impacts? And like coming into projects with like volatility and high risk projects, how do you ensure that okay, this project is going to have like the I would say like the appropriate impacts?
Yeah, impact measurement is really hard. I I think it depends a lot on what you do. Like at Planet A Ventures, the company that I'm working for now, we put a lot of emphasis on impact measurement. I mean, you can check out our website. We write like 60-page impact reports for the companies that we're investing in. You can check them out there. But as you said, those are like very high risk type investments that we do, because if we invest in a company, they're super early stage, and it's all very much impact potential versus any impact that they will likely generate in the next 2-3 years. So what we sort of do is that we're doing a little bit of impact forecasting, right? We're looking at what we call the improvement rate, like how much better is this new product or service, and then once we have this improvement rate, sort of overlaying it with the market potential and how much they're likely to scale. So it's really an impact forecasting, because if you invest in a startup that is 2 guys in a lab somewhere, then the impact is like 8 years out, but the impact is likely, or hopefully in the best case, going to be very scalable and large. So that's very different from if you help, I don't know, rural farmers in Bangladesh with access to education, and you can count literally every single kid that you give access to education. So it's sort of hard to generalize, but I think you should think about how you measure impact and what types of frameworks and tools you can use. And if I remember correctly, Jeff, you guys had like quite some resources, etc., that you shared, like from different frameworks and stuff.
Yeah, and I've done 2 just general impact measurement workshops, and I'll be doing at least 2 or 3 more that will be more related to different topics, right? So after we've gotten as many concept notes in as possible in early January, we'll have some based on, like, say for example, we have a lot on food insecurity, food access and affordability, sustainability in agriculture and food, creating workshops around impact measurement related to those topics. So
yeah, and you have to be rigorous about it. To be honest, in our own fundraising, that question always came up, and I think we've actually missed out on quite some pools of money because our impact framework wasn't rigorous enough for them, because we're a super small organization, so we can't pay people to go on the ground and check on things, which I guess the more you'd professionalize, you'd be able to afford that. But definitely it's something that came up with donors a lot, that you have to be very, 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 very rigorous about the impact measurement. And I think the other thing you were asking is about scalability.
Yeah, I have a question on like what should we take in mind when we were brainstorming and coming up with ideas and for concept notes. And obviously I've seen that like scalability is a big thing that like all the previous like projects have in common. And what the like other aspects or components like should we have taken in mind before we actually come with our project note?
Yeah, I mean, I would frame it that way. I mean, you're in the great luxury to work on difficult problems without any constraints, right? So why wouldn't you choose or pick the biggest problems that you can possibly find out there? And that's sort of translates into scalability. I think last year there were some teams that worked on, I don't know, some very specific solar financing solution for one state in the US, for instance, which is obviously great and there's local impact, but if you're really starting from scratch, then why don't you think about something that is like more universally applicable and more generalizable and can create a much larger impact if it's the same kind of work to set up that project, right? I mean, if you're passionate about a very specific local problem, I think that's great, and then go for it. But if you're sort of starting from scratch and you have no idea where to go, then definitely try to find the biggest problem, because then you'll also have the biggest impact linked with that. And if I compare the NGO where we've raised maybe by now, maybe €500,000, and then I compare my company where I've also been very much involved in the fundraising, where we've raised €160 million. It's the same fundraising process, right? It's the same sort of pain and the same things that you have to go through. So if you can choose, then why don't you go for like the bigger reward for the same kind of work?
That makes sense. Thank you.
I have a question. Thank you for speaking with us today. I'd love to hear what you feel like differentiated your project just from other projects in terms of strategy. You talked a lot about, the challenges that your project faced and kind of going through the process of revamping. But like through that process, what do you think really differentiated your strategy?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, what our idea was in a nutshell was saying there's a lot of underprivileged entrepreneurs with great potential that you could enable by directing more financial flows there, and sort of have this potentially very large indirect effect where you say, okay, instead of giving direct support to 1 million people, you can enable maybe 10 entrepreneurs who serve those million people. So it's like it's indirect but much larger impact. And I think that's sort of the nice thing. And now, almost 4 years into the NGO, it's amazing to see what kind of things our entrepreneurs achieved, right? Simply with this very simple idea of we don't know what the best solution for the context is, but we can find someone who is passionate about the project, about the problem, and then support them. And I think that sort of idea probably is what I personally like a lot. And then what the judges liked about it, I mean, it's hard for me to tell, but I think the main takeaway for me really was that we really constantly iterated, took their feedback seriously, and then really tried to incorporate all of that and put a lot of effort into making sure that it's a well-rounded model. Because to be honest, when we started out, I think what we were pitching probably did not make much sense, because we didn't know much about blended finance. So this constant improvement plus then relatively simple but very scalable idea probably made sense. In the end, it's also not the most innovative thing, right? There's probably lots of other organizations out there also supporting founders and entrepreneurs, but we tried to bring a different twist to it with this blended finance structure that we sort of developed.
I brought up some of the comments if you want me to read them.
Yeah. Do I want to hear them, or?
I'll read the positive ones. How's that? No, so I mean, and these are the interesting thing about this, and what I like about how it's set up, is that you get individual comments, and Florian, you can speak to this too. I think you spoke to it last year a little bit too. Is there can be some frustration too, right? Because you have different judges who have different perspectives on what's important, and then you have to take this and figure out, okay, so what's going to get me, in the competition to the next round, but then hopefully at the end of the entire challenge, you're saying, okay, so out of all of that response that we got, what matters most to us with implementation of the actual initiative, right? But I mean, one was, I like the flexibility given to ventures funded through declaring which SDG goals the participant wants to address, and the measuring the progress as they go. And I'm not editing these, so remember, people are typing pretty fast when they do these. There's a ton of need. The problem is scale. So you were talking about that earlier, right, Florian? Was if you have the ability to show scale from the beginning, then choose the way that's going to show that scale. Let's see here.
I remembered one thing, like one of my friends who was part of the project, right? She's actually doing a PhD in that field, but she worked in impact measurement, and that was sort of her thing. And so she develop this like very, almost too sophisticated like impact measurement framework and thinking and blah blah blah. So we spent a lot of time on the measurement side of things, which for some of the donors was not enough, but I felt like there was definitely also a big differentiator that maybe other people hadn't thought much about, how to actually measure it, how to guarantee it, and how to sort of express what kind of impact that you have, which is not always super trivial, especially if you work on something as fluffy as supporting entrepreneurs, because the impact can be manifold and, on a systemic level, but also very direct level. So it's really not that easy. And I think but that's what I liked at least about our own project, or about the work that we're still doing, is that we put a lot of effort on the impact side of things, because the flip side of supporting entrepreneurs also is that I think we've done an impact report in the summer for the last year, and out of the first cohort, 30% of the entrepreneurs that we supported are out of business, right? Because they just didn't manage to scale their business and they run out of money at some point, right? So that's the other side, but the other 70%, they made up for those losses because they scaled a lot and they've generated much impact. But you have to be honest about that, because there will always be downsides to any model, and the downside of our model is that it's a bit probabilistic that not all your entrepreneurs you support will have impact. But yeah, so just thinking about the level and direction of your impact probably is an important one.
Yeah, and I guess the other just skimming through them quickly, addressing a strategy on, I think this might be the first round. I just searched in my computer and this is the first one that came up. This might be during the first round, but was addressing more, providing more on the criteria for investment, which you definitely did by the end. So I think this is early stage. And then credit risk and currency risk was something that was brought up with you too. But obviously they won. So these are always comments. Judges will provide comments. Remember, they type quickly. They have a certain amount of time in their day to be able to provide you with responses. So it might not always be like, they might not have, like with my class, right, Murphy, is start with a very positive comment and then get to the opportunities for improvement. They'll be like, need to address credit risk, and that's like might be all it says, right? So all right, more questions for Florian.
If not, I have a question. I'm curious what people are working on and what kinds of ideas are floating around the room. If anyone feels like sharing.
Yeah, and right before, so y'all get ready to say what you're going to say about sharing your topics. Florian, when there were opportunities to hear and share what you're doing with other students, can you talk about the benefits of being able to do that and being able to listen to other student ideas and maybe just to hear what people are working on when you were part of the competition?
Yeah, absolutely. You learn a lot about what others are doing, right? Because everyone is starting from a very different proposition. So I feel like we've definitely taken on some ideas of others who might be working on very different projects, but then you realize, maybe that's an interesting mechanism we can think about, or maybe that's a way of presenting things. So I think we've attended pretty much all the sessions and everything there was, and I think it was very helpful. For not only for the peer learning, but also because the mentors were usually quite helpful. And we had Victor, I think another guy. I don't know if he's still on the program, but he was very helpful, and he was hopping on 2 calls or so with us to figure things out with us. So everyone was genuinely like super open, and that really helped us a lot, that we could get their input sort of outside of the program as well, if you ask them kindly. As a tip, for sure. I don't have a concrete example, but I'm sure we've learned a lot from the other pitches as well. And sort of a lot from other NGOs, to be honest. I mean, pretty much we've spoken to probably every other NGO that does a similar work in the sort of geographies that we're working in. It's nice to connect with people, get some ideas, and sort of get a bit inspired, because you don't have to reinvent the wheel, and certainly we did not reinvent the wheel. It's just improving it slightly.
I'll just add to that a little bit, is that, you know, because what you said is that everybody's working on very different projects, even if it's I used the example of food earlier, each one, and I can look at the concept notes myself, they're very different. So it's not like you kind of have to keep things close to the vest. You actually all will learn more by sharing about what you're working on as well. So with that, who wants to start off and share with Florian what some of the ideas are, because I'm sure that he'll have some feedback and ideas for all of you as well. Do I need to pull on my cold calling?
And if not, it's always fine. You can always drop me a message. I mean, I know it's always a bit awkward to speak up in the call, so happy to take any messages if you want afterwards, on LinkedIn or email or whatever.
You gave them an out too quickly, Florian.
Yeah,
you need to sit in silence for a little while. Somebody speaks up.
Fine.
Yeah. So, who wants to talk about just the general topics of what you all are working on?
Can y'all hear me? I'm in like a busy
Yes.
coffee shop.
Yeah.
Okay. We're still working on fleshing out everything. But we have a couple ideas floating around. We just want to really make sure that like our scalability and impact is there, which are a couple of things that we were lacking in the previous time we did Lift Challenge. Idea that we're floating around right now is large scale mobile home community solar developments. Essentially, the mobile home landscape in the United States as becoming a very popular low-income housing option. Community solar would allow them to have a more disposable income. If you're not familiar, like mobile home, you're not actually owning your property. If you are even owning the mobile home at all. And so it just puts a little bit more wealth into the hands of those families or individuals. A lot of times are also owned by racial or gender minorities in the communities that they serve. And so we're fleshing out, you know, there are a lot of wrinkles and gaps in the idea in terms of, you know, ownership. The people that own the land can be tricky in terms of, you know, they could sell off that at any point, so they would have to be a stakeholder in that, but sort of the idea at that point.
Yeah, super interesting idea. I feel like it tackles a lot of different impact topics at once, social and then environmental, and then as we said, sort of economic empowerment seems to be like a super important one. Do you know what the main problem is? Why those communities don't or wouldn't use solar at the moment?
The largest problem is that there are a lot. This has already been a project in states that have a very well developed green bank, like Michigan, Connecticut. But in the Southeast, we're notoriously known to not allow large scale solar because of our utilities. Community solar is something that is talked about a lot, but is very difficult to employ because of the utilities that are in the Southeast. And so the issue would be essentially you want to decrease the cost of energy for the families, but at the same time you need to have a return. And so that's where we're struggling to, because we operate as a nonprofit right now, and we've toyed with the idea of community solar for not just projects in general. And we've continuously run into the issue of like literal legal battles between not being able to create a project that has the return that we're allowed to get. So simply just being allowed to be paid back for the project. And then two, it takes a lot of stakeholders within the process. One of those being local and state government most of the time, because it just makes the project a little bit easier. So I think for the Lift Challenge, we sort of thought of this because it is feasible. It's just a lot of work. And so the Lift Challenge is sort of the perfect like avenue to explore this, because we don't actually have to be contacting local government officials right now. But it is, possible. It's just, it's tricky. But then I want to look at other states such as Michigan and the West and Northeast and see how they did their projects. It's just that their utilities allow for these projects to happen, and their grid allows for it a little bit easier. Our grid is just, not the best in the country, but but yeah, there's a lot of issues. And then, you just continuing to make it equitable. You don't want these people, you don't want to employ a solar project or a renewable energy project and actually, you're helping the environment, but if you're not actually creating an equitable, clean energy transition, then what's the point on that end? But yeah.
Yeah, super interesting. As you said, you wanna empower those people to participate and have them have them benefit economically as well. I think the interesting thing about solar projects in my experience is that it's usually only a matter of upfront financing. That's sort of the main issue, because then, as you said, there's a super clear ROI and it makes economic sense. You just have to help those people finance the upfront financing costs. And I can only speak of Europe, but from what we see here is that banks are super lenient to finance those things, even when people are not credit worthy, because there's still underlying assets that you can use, which makes it a little easier. And if you then have the social cost, I'm sure there's someone who writes like guarantees and stuff too. Yeah, sounds super interesting. Yeah. Anyone else?
Who else wants to share? It can be as general or specific as you want. Just what kind of topic you're exploring. Or do you have other questions that you want answered before the coaching session's over that you really wanted to get out of today? So Florian, I have a question that maybe, because we talked a lot about the importance of impact measurement, right? And so if you are, what would you say your strategy should be if you're coming into this and you're like, well, these are the obvious impacts I see because I'm interested in, fill in the blank topic. What would your strategy be to identify the how impacts are properly measured for that topic, and then maybe the risks that would make those impacts not occur if you were to go forward with your project? So does that make sense what I'm saying? Like what, because I think understanding that these are the impacts that if everything were perfect, we would see from the project that we've dreamed of creating, right? And then I think even with the example that Kaya was just providing, there will be barriers to making sure that impact could ever be seen. So if you're just starting from scratch, how do you identify those? Is that a fair question?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, on sort of maybe on the first part of your question, I think you want to have an impact measurement framework that is rigorous but also easy to follow. Like, don't try to reinvent something or come up with something completely new. I think that's not the point of it. Like the best example is with in my kind of work here at Planet A. Over the last 2-3 years, there's been a lot of money that was poured into climate venture capital funds because, well, sort of realizing that we need more innovation to finance to manage the energy transition and stuff. And a lot of new funds popped up. and a lot of them tried to come up with their own impact methodology of, how they assess environmental impact. The problem with that is it's super obscure and super hard to follow, because like no one understands how it works. It's just like you making up your own method of assessing impact. And we took a different turn, and we said, okay, we actually just take what is the standard in the scientific literature, which is life cycle assessments, and that's sort of the established methodology that people use to quantify, or the main methodology that people use to quantify environmental impacts. And we'll just use that because people understand it, people can work with it, and it's sort of accepted, right? And the same, I mean, obviously LCAs that we work with is probably much too complex for most of the projects that you work with, and not necessary. But what I want to say is just have a look at the resources and see which frameworks fit for you. And also, if you know what you're working on, try to find organizations which work on a similar topic but very successfully, and see how they do it. I mean, again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, especially when it comes to your impact framework, because it has to be somewhat comparable to others. It has to be easily comprehensible for people. So if you develop your own KPI, which measures social, environmental impact and everything at the same time, but people can't verify how you do that, then that's not a great way of going about it, I think. But yeah, just look what others are doing. I think that's the best way of going about, I would say, on coming up with an impact framework. And now I forgot the second part of your question, Jeff.
How do you show that you're ready for the barriers that will inevitably pop up, even if you don't know what those barriers are yet, right? Because I think that judges like to see that as well.
Mitigating the impact risks, yeah, that's a good one. I think it probably depends on the problem that you're working with. But when we do those life cycle assessments, you always think about sort of second order effects. So what's like the downstream sort of consequences and what changes on a systemic level. Like we, for instance, invested in a company that produces bio-based plastics to reduce fossil-based plastics, but they take agricultural waste streams as inputs. So as one of the second order effects, it means that biomass that is being used for something else now is used to produce plastic. So you're replacing some other process, etc. So, thinking about those systemic consequences, I think is a way, and then you can, write them down and have a list of uncertainties. And similarly, thinking about, yeah, what sort of is the risk of the impact not materializing. And I think that probably depends on your approach. So I can only speak of our project. And for us, for instance, because we sort of worked with entrepreneurs, and maybe you can call them startups, we knew that not everyone will survive the first 2 years. So there's the impact projections that we'll make will not work out for all of them. But it was relatively easy for us to navigate that, because it's the same from a financial perspective. If I'm a venture capital investor and I do 30 investments in one fund, I know that 15 of them will go bankrupt, right? But it's a portfolio level approach. So I know that the others will make up for that impact or for that money that I lose there, and then the returns will be much bigger. And the same is for the impact, that if you take such an approach as we did, then it all sort of averages out in the end. That's the whole idea behind it, that you can take sort of higher risks. But yeah, that might not be applicable to, for instance, the solar project that you were talking about, because there's very little risk, and the risks might be very different compared to the one approach that we took. But yeah, being aware of it is probably maybe a good starting point.
There's a question in chat. It says, "Hi, Florian, how do you evaluate early entrepreneurs who only have impact potential without being able to show measurable impact, at least for the first 3 years? Could you break down the different areas that you look at for measuring impact potential? Also, what are the challenges you face evaluating such startups, and what would you like them to do more of when pitching to you?"
I like that question. Yeah. So, I mean, we only look at within Planet A, we only look at environmental impact. So in my job, and we break it down into CO2 emissions, waste that is being avoided, biodiversity effects, and resource saving, sort of less land use, for instance. So that's like four clearly defined KPIs that are easily calculatable, because you can, through that LCA, you can calculate the CO2 footprint over, the whole process of producing that bioplastic, for instance. So per ton of material how much CO2 is being emitted, and then you can compare that to how much CO2 emissions are emitted through a ton of fossil-based plastics. And then that this plastic is biodegradable, so you will save a ton of waste compared to the fossil-based alternative. So, and measuring environmental impact is easy because we have it on a product level then, and we know what the impact per ton is. And then if I wanted to forecast the absolute impact, I would just have to look at what do we think they could realistically scale to if everything works out. So we have like the impact potential, but either way, I know that for every unit they produce, the impact is already positive, right? But just how much will depend on how much they scale. So that's sort of what we do. And then, as you said, the first few years, there's going to be barely any measurable impact, because the measurable impact kicks in once they can start licensing the technology and not only produce a few kilotons like they do now, but hopefully produce at scale. But yeah, for us, it's really about the impact potential, and that's how we measure it. In the NGO, we had a lot of social impact as well. We do have a lot of social impact cases because we work with education and healthcare startups. So that's much harder to assess because it's a little bit more subjective and not easy to break down, because we've made a lot of mistakes and tried out a lot of things. Like, you can take a number of jobs created, but that doesn't tell you anything about the quality, or if it's equitable jobs, etc. So it's really hard getting the social impact indicators right. And that's why I think the environmental impact side, that's what I can speak more of, is a little bit easier. And when to your last point about what we like seeing when they pitch to us, being I mean, everything else I guess has to be as with normal pitches, but then on the impact side of things, just being aware of that, right, and knowing what kind of impact topics you address. I think the most common case is that we have people pitching us and they believe they have such an impactful technology, but they never actually looked at the impact KPIs. And then when we do, we have to tell them, hey, it's a great business, but it's just not creating much impact. And we've had a lot of people in the educational sector that were applying to the incubation programs where there was just no additionality because they weren't doing anything that was not already being done. They just found a different way of monetizing that, for instance, right? Which is great for them, and it might be a good business, but it would not have brought a single kid more into an educational program that wasn't before, right? So, I think being honest about the impact and thinking about it is probably important. And on the environmental impact side, I think the main example that everyone is always giving is sort of if you think about e-bikes, right? Are e-bikes sustainable or not? Well, the answer to that question sort of depends on what are you replacing. Because if people stop walking and using e-bikes instead, then it's maybe not sustainable. But if you actually decide to not buy a car because you use your electric bike, then it's actually a super large impact, because you're reducing the emissions a lot by every mile that you basically travel. So, but as a company, just think about these things and be honest to yourself, right? Because it can still be a great business case, but maybe if you just stop people from walking but don't replace a single car on the roads, then it might not be super impactful.
It's a great point. Thank you so much, Florian.
I still have another question.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Is it still time? Okay. It's for you, Florian. So our group's idea until now, it sort of requires multiple sort of applications. So for example, not just solar power panels, but also different sensors, different drones, and different sort of robotics. So my question is, how along the way of doing research and making up the pitch, how do we have checkpoints to making sure that it's feasible and keeping it realistic.
Hard to say. I mean, you mean feasible from a technical or from a financial perspective?
Well, both actually. I'm not too worried about the technical sides of stuff because it's yeah, but financially, yes, we're more worried about that.
Hmm. I mean, I guess there's from a blended finance perspective, yeah, the feasibility probably depends on sort of the level of. I mean, if you think about a spectrum, there might be technologies which is very much on the commercial side, and they make sense without any catalytic capital. But you're probably not going to be there because otherwise you wouldn't be developing a blended finance concept. So you will be likely more down on the spectrum where it's not commercially viable without catalytic capital or some blended finance structure. And then I wouldn't be so worried about the feasibility because as long as there's impact behind, I feel like it just means that you're sliding down on the scale and need more maybe grant money or different types of financing to complement the commercial capital that you have in. I don't know if that's helpful at all, but that's maybe I don't know. I would not be so concerned about the financial viability in the first place if you think that the impact is great and the technology works out.
Okay, yeah, glad to hear that. Thank you.
All
I don't
right.
know
Well,
if you would agree or disagree with that, but
I came here with as a blank page of paper, so you just put something in for me. So that's great. Thank you.
wonderful. We have come up on time, so I want to be cognizant of your time, Florian. Thank you so much for everything. If there are follow-up questions, are there certain ways that you're okay with us to either send those to you or for them to reach out to you? What's your preference, Florian?
yeah, happy to share my email maybe here in the chat,
Okay.
and then you can maybe actually my work email is the easiest because it's at least the inbox I see the most. So yeah, just drop me an email if you have any questions. Happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Florian. So good to see you. Appreciate
Yes,
your time
likewise.
today.
Great seeing everybody, guys, and yeah, good luck with the competition, and hope you develop some great projects in the end.
Fantastic. Thank you. Please take care of yourself. Bye.
Thank you.
All right. I have an 11 a.m. meeting.
Bye. Thank you for organizing this.
Of course. Thank you. Have a great day. Okay.
Have a good one.